So why does the study of history matter?
To me, when we think about history and how does it apply to our daily modern lives, it's so obvious, and yet maybe people don't quite understand the fact that our history, really human history, is a series of relationships that we've made with one another. And I think when we look back at what took place, it's important to understand it fully, right, from all perspectives. And hopefully, if the outcome of that relationship was negative or bad, or if it had a lasting negative effect on people, I think we need to review that. It's going to inform our future. The decisions our leaders make must be rooted in the mistakes and the successes of the past for the good of humanity.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. So why don't you tell us briefly the story of Jigonhsasee?
Okay. The story of Jigonhsasee, the Mother of Nations, as it was told to me long ago, it's an important story, and it comes at a time when there were various indigenous nations here in the Northeast that were experiencing generational trauma and warfare, bloodshed amongst themselves. And in many ways, that period of war and chaos was being led by the men. War chiefs, war leaders, these war captains, they were the ones who were perpetuating this system. That's all they had known. They had been brought up in it, in a culture of warfare. And to see anybody outside of your community, your small community, as an enemy. And others saw you that way too. So this period of conflict was long lasting, and it took place over many generations. So it became a central component of their culture. And a man came among them. A man was born on the north of Lake Ontario, and he was a Huron, and he had an idea. And this idea that was planted in his head, they say, came directly from the Creator. And the idea was to bring about a peace by using a law, a way of thinking, and the power of the good mind, which is how they describe it, which could unify this region and people and bring to them peace, bring to them a sense of righteousness and safety for themselves and others. And he looked for helpers. When he encountered, along what they call the warrior's path, he encountered a building, a house. And in the house there was a woman who lived there. And they called her Jigonhsasee, which means, she has a wide face. And her role was being situated along this warrior's path. The men that would travel from the west would go through her territory. The men who travel from the east, looking to bring war, would travel through her territory. She'd invite them in, and she'd feed them and take care of them. And sometimes they say that she had to put a curtain up in her house because the enemies were on either side of her home, and she was taking care of both of them and giving them a place to stay. And they told her what they were going to do. They told her their intent and what they'd been through. And she kind of took all that in. And so when the peacemaker, this Huron man with his great ideas of peace, when he came to her, he shared with her his ideas, and nearly immediately she understood the benefit of what he was proposing. And furthermore, as he told her what he intended and what he had hoped he could bring to the people here, he said to her, really, in a way, that she was contributing to this problem and that she would have to stop what she's doing. And in a simple way, when you think about what he really said to her, was she's representing all the women, actually. All the women who are allowing this to go on. And in simply allowing things to go on the way they always have, they're being complicit. They're in their inactivity, they become an active player in perpetuating this system. And then it was really going to be up to the women of all those nations and all those villages, all those communities, to stop what they were doing and make a change. And she accepted that, and she realized that she had now to take on a new role, a representative for all the women, and to make a stand and stand up for something positive, this new great law of peace. And she did. With her help, the peacemaker and a very important man named Ayanwentha, they were able to unify all of the nations, and even the most violent nation at the time, being led by the Tadodaho, they were able to overcome him. With her help, they were only able to overcome him and his chaotic mind with her help, the help of the leaders of the other four nations, and the power of the good mind.
That's awesome.
And it's a long story, but
no,
yeah.
That's exactly what I wanted.
So try to get it, pare it down. It's a 7-day story.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Who are the Tadodaho? Or is that the Mohawk or?
No, Tadodaho was a powerful war leader, and in some people's minds, they describe him as a wizard. He had tremendous power. His voice had actual power in it, and that could affect the natural world. And he led his people with this, with the fear of his powers, but also because of his success in war. They followed him. He was a war leader. And they characterize him in the stories as having unnatural bends in his limbs, which had come from war and repeated blows that had healed unnaturally. And they said that he lived, and his mind was so chaotic and unsettled. They use a metaphorical description that snakes lived in his hair, right? And so in the process of accepting peace, it took all the leadership of those, the peacemaker, Ayanwentha and Jigonhsasee, and the leaders of the four nations, which had been newly installed as now peace, counselors for peace. They were able to, they say metaphorically, massage his limbs straight again and comb the serpents from his hair, sort of re-establishing in him a peaceful frame of mind.
Okay, that combing, that I might have heard something about that before. That sounds familiar. Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm going to be taking a second to
You're fine,
clear
you're
my
fine.
throat.
Just for my knowledge, to my understanding, then the four nations. What was the fifth nation we were waiting on?
The fifth nation being led by the Tadodaho are the Onondaga, and through the process of this establishment of the great law, they become the fifth nation and the seat, you might say, for a general grand council for all the leadership of all the five nations. That's the Onondaga people, who are referred to as the keepers of the central fire, and who still maintain this chieftainship leadership. They also maintain the Grand Sachem title of Tadodaho. There is a Tadodaho today, Mr. Sid Hill, who's leading the Haudenosaunee people from Onondaga.
Awesome. So that's near the Syracuse area. That's the tree on the.
That's right.
Oh,
Yep.
That's awesome to know. I didn't know any of that. That's really cool. Also, for my information, Jigonhsasee, what tribe was she from?
So Jigonhsasee comes from a place in between nations. You have all the Haudenosaunee people situated more or less from west to east, on the northern tips of the Finger Lakes, all the way to, we'll say, the Champlain Valley. Bounded on the west by the Genesee River, we'll say. And at the time of the Confederation, the story of Confederation, the people who lived in between the Haudenosaunee and the Western Great Lakes, the people in what is now Southern Ontario, Canada, they're called in the history books the neutral, but the word they use is Gatqua. These are the people who lived there. So she comes from those people who are sort of in between, right?
Okay, that's good to know. I don't want to misstep here. All right. Okay, so let's see. Could you I'm not sure how far we're going to go down this path. There's so much we're trying to fit into this one film,
Yeah.
But could you just make any little statements? This has to do with the influence of this confederation. First, as it influences, Benjamin Franklin, the Albany Plan, he's trying to unite the European colonies. I've seen the sketch of him with the various Native American sachems talking about this. Can you just make a few statements about that?
I could do it in a broad way, I think would be helpful. When the new American colonies were considering separating themselves from their sovereign, England, there was a lot to consider, I think, from their point of view. One thing, I think, one fact, is that those colonies were interacting closely, directly, with the large Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and they had been interacting with them for nearly a century. And I think there was some powerful influence that the model of the Confederacy, and possibly more importantly, some fundamental ideas that Haudenosaunee people held regarding liberty and freedom, individual freedoms, that affected, in a way, the minds of those colonial people and the leadership. They'd written about it. Franklin and Jefferson directly had contact with Haudenosaunee and other confederacies. Keep that in mind, too, not just the Haudenosaunee. But ideas of liberty and what I think people aspire to, American freedom and American liberties, probably had its origin in indigenous thought and concepts of individual sovereignty. And it's been written about quite a bit. As early as the 1600s, European observers, mention that the indigenous population has a very powerful sense of their own liberty. In other words, they have a sense that there is no sovereign over them, that they have total free will. And if you really look carefully at how Haudenosaunee people govern and how they conduct themselves in, treaty negotiations or even in war, whatever, you'll see that there is this underlying thread that individual freedom and free will really supersedes all other possible influences. So you might have an entire population dedicated to one idea, that maybe they're going to defend their border or take up the hatchet, so to speak, against another nation. And yet, the only thing compelling the individual is the power and of the words of those in proposing that idea. And yet, they may actually turn their back and decide not to, whatever. Their personal interest, the interest of them, their families, ends up being the most important factor in when individuals make decisions. And I think probably that concept of not having that ultimate sovereign which dictates to you where you can plant, where you can put your house, where your fence lies, if you can hunt in the forest or not, or does this land even belong to you, or can you use the land itself? Like, those ideas are incredibly powerful and should never be overlooked when you really consider what is the indigenous influence on American democracy. I think that's really the most powerful message I could share.
Yeah, that's really cool. Really cool. Can you speak into, so I don't know if I mentioned this in an email or something, but my wife is a descendant of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Oh, cool.
And we came across, one time when we toured the museum, seeing the connection there and everything. I don't know if Susan B. ever visited one of the Haudenosaunee anywhere, but I heard that Elizabeth did, and Lucretia Mott and such. But can you just speak into that connection,
Sure.
the inspiration that would come to women's suffrage?
Yeah. In the United States, we're coming up on anniversary years which commemorate, I should start over again.
Yeah,
I lost
fine.
my thought there.
That's fine.
So in the United States, and in New York State in particular, we're experiencing the centennial celebrations of the women's rights movement and the process to find equity and justice in the United States, in America, right? And the leadership of those movements, women like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, interacted directly with Haudenosaunee women and Haudenosaunee leadership to begin to understand, try to understand really, how is it that a society was formed where women, in a way, held a balance of responsibility in their community, both politically, religiously, and socially. And in that interaction, and through those experiences of the late 1800s, early 1900s, I think had an impact on them. We know that at speeches, when they gave speeches and held rallies, that they talked about Indigenous women, they talked about Native women, and the responsibilities, the roles that they held in their communities, everything from, in the Haudenosaunee perspective, from electing, or I should say selecting leadership, right, male leadership, to having the freedom to walk in the evening in your community in the early 1900s without fear of molestation, some things like that. Also, ideas really that were really powerful were senses of property, that women held property, in fact, were the only property owners, that they were the ones who supported their community through agriculture. They were the leaders of their own families and leaders of their clan families. And so they had tremendous responsibility and great influence for the positive in their community. So those leaders of the American suffrage movement, when they learned about that, I think it was a great inspiration. And we can point to those intersections historically in the written record.
All right, just a little bit more for people to understand the matriarchal society. How did this happen? I understand it happened through the Great Law of Peace, right? It was established. I think we kind of touched on that already. So one question people might have is, then, was this like female dominated? I know you already mentioned that they elected male leadership. So how does it, who's really in charge, or how do you understand? How do I understand?
Right.
Because the chiefs are still male, but the females are selecting them. How does that all work together?
Okay.
There seems to be like a balance of power between the sexes, maybe, or something. I don't know.
Leadership in Haudenosaunee culture is a complicated matter, but to sort of break down the basics of how leadership and what we call chiefs and clan mothers and how that all goes down, it's fairly simple. each nation has a number of families within it. And today you might call those clans, okay? Not everybody in the clan is directly related by blood, but the clan, being so ancient, unites them as one family. Seneca people have 8 clans. They've got turtle, wolf, beaver, bear, heron, hawk, snipe, and deer. And amongst those clans, each clan has a leader, okay? This person is a woman, and in English they'll call them a clan mother. And typically this person is an older person, someone who's gained enough experience, life experience, is versed in their culture, in their language, especially the ceremonial cycle today. That's really important. Long ago, they held the same, they had to have held the same important attributes too. And the clan, right, is the one, they're the people, and the clan mother will hold a clan meeting and hear the minds of all the people. Now, the clan mothers of each nation select from their brothers, who would be from the same clan as them, or their children, the sons of that woman, male leadership. And today, people say chief. And I think that word probably isn't the best. It has all kinds of baggage that comes along with it. But probably a counselor would be the best way to put that. I think the best wording. And the native words, Hoyane, relate more to their responsibilities to the people, right? So these men are the spokesperson for the clan and the clan mother. And they, are unified in, with the other counselors, right, of their nation. And they decide and make decisions that impact their nation. The singular leaders make decisions that impact their community, and there's other leadership roles, but essentially that's what you have. Now, the titles of those chiefs, we'll call them sachems. That's a good word. The titles or the names of those sachems is immutable. There are 50 across the Confederacy. And new people are installed in those titles, selected by the clan mothers to be in that role. The titles, more or less in this way, are the property, you might say, of the women, the clan mothers. If that leader is not following the advice of their clan mothers, those clan mothers now have a responsibility to change his mind and put him on the right path again. He gets 3 chances to do that. And after that point, the clan mothers now know that they don't have a representative anymore. And they remove him from office, which is a great shame. Furthermore, his descendants are no longer eligible for title. And so they have to then put in a new leader. And from what reading in history, there's not much mentioned about that process, but certain individuals paid close attention to it, and they wrote very extensively about it, and they, in a way, codified what is the exact sort of rules and how the process goes, But it's a simple way of doing things. There are no elections. The leaderships, clan mothers and sachems, they do not draw salaries, they do not receive pensions, they do not take vacations. Their whole responsibility is the burden of responsibility to their people, which is tremendous. If you really sit and consider that you're now taking on the responsibility for hundreds, if not thousands of people, that's a great responsibility. And probably not many people would want it, actually. So there are no elections. Nobody campaigns to be one of those leaders because it's not an enviable job. It's a difficult job.
Yeah. All right. Purpose of these questions is sort of to speak into identity. So we're thinking, starting with these 5 warring nations, they must have, had major clashes of identity, and they're at war for some reason. So maybe start with, I'll tell you the whole concept, and you can just briefly share. So what were some of the differing identities, if you can speak into that or not, and what might they have had, in order to come to peace, they probably had to give up certain things so that they could come to a united level of values or something. So what can you say into that? Why are they at war? You kind of talked about it a little bit already. So what might they have had to give up to become united like this? Might be repeating some things you've said a little bit. So just briefly.
The great time of chaos and warfare that the original Haudenosaunee people experienced really people don't talk about how it began. And so there isn't a single incident or, slight or infraction that anyone can point to as to why it happened. But you might infer from understanding the story and what was taking place at the time that it was men who found themselves in charge and being relied upon more than the women. And possibly this is a teaching moment when you have absolute control and absolute leadership in the hands of men solely. The tendency might be to tribalize, nationalize, and regard everybody outside of your community as an enemy. And I'm really talking deeply about the subject without any oral history context. No one's ever explained that to me and said that. It's just my own impression that this could be really what was going on, and that it required the people to accept that in order to find peace, first of all, to accept that peace is a better state to be in than war, than chaos. They had to accept also that there must be total equity amongst the people in terms of leadership too, equity amongst men and women, and that possibly the balance of power, the balance of responsibility really should be in the hands of the women. And that idea, that concept that they arrived at, as I described before, was a gift from the Creator. It really afforded the Haudenosaunee people, since that time long ago, the Seneca people say around 1,000 years ago, it really afforded the people many, many centuries of peace and prosperity. And it worked for a long, long time. It really, really worked, but it suffered during colonialism.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really good. That's real helpful. Let's see. Oh, I remembered one thing I want to ask about at the end. Let's go to your understanding of some of the first Europeans coming in our research were the French, and and then eventually the French Jesuits as Christian missionaries. So do you have anything to say about how the French Jesuits interacted, if it was a positive or a negative, how they were received or not received, how it's looked at historically now, those kind of thoughts about the French Jesuits?
The Jesuits in North America deserve their own documentary. They really were the first Christian group to really have an impact on Haudenosaunee people. But we know that they had the greatest impact on the Huron Confederacy initially. And, in every single Haudenosaunee community, from the Mohawk people to the Seneca, there is a Jesuit story. And in some cases, it was more positive than others. The Jesuit Society, the Brotherhood of Jesuits, did some amazing things, I should say that. They were amazing chroniclers, and they recorded history in a way that no one else had for Haudenosaunee people, because they were more or less embedded in the communities. And initially, their strategy to sharing their message of Christ was to establish their mission in the communities themselves, understand the language, try to understand the people, and develop a strategy from within to bring the word of Christ to the Haudenosaunee people. For the Senecas, the first mission occurs in the late 1660s, I think 1668, maybe 69, and the father was Father Fremin, and he writes in his relation, they have this amazing resource called the Jesuit Relations, which these priests reported back to France what was going on in the state of their mission work. And in his chronicle of work amongst the Seneca people in 1669, he said he found the most, well, I should say, I'm going to slow down and tell you the story real quick. When he arrives, coincidentally, he writes in his journal that a great disease swept through the communities. He didn't realize that he had brought the disease with him. And in the next year, in that winter, 10% of the Seneca population died. And he writes that he was so grateful to have the chance to baptize so many on their deathbed, because it was bringing people to Christ. I'm not sure if he had a sense of really what was going on in terms of contagions and immune systems of the native population. I don't know. But looking back, it's like horrifying, actually. But he found his initial great success because people were dying so in so many numbers and getting sick. And then he recognizes that amongst the Seneca are actually communities of absorbed nations. And he finds communities of adult Hurons that are living amongst the Seneca people who had been born Christians and had been raised in the Catholic tradition in their homelands. But then during the Huron and Haudenosaunee wars, they were brought into the communities and absorbed, But they were delighted to find Fremin, who they had been waiting for, they said, and been praying for their entire lives. And so the greatest success that the Jesuit mission had amongst the Seneca wasn't with the Senecas. In fact, it was with the Hurons who were living here now as Senecas. But that mission was short-lived, didn't last long. He wrote back and needed help to kind of keep and perpetuate the mission. He asked another famous Jesuit named Garnier, Father Garnier, to come and help. And he did. but the Seneca ended up rejecting, in a way, the message. They hadn't, up until that point, really been exposed to the ideas of the Jesuit form of Catholicism, but they'd heard it, and they weren't interested in it, and they rejected it.
Okay. I had read, I forget which priest it is now, but at some point, this is New France, and the French military, Denonville and all that, want to come down. I know there was one priest who was trying to stand in the Haudenosaunee behest, to please don't do this, but they were recalled up to Montreal or wherever, Quebec, and then the horrible march came. And
yeah, well, I mean, there's a really sort of poignant. I'll just share the story real quick. In 1687, the French decide to invade Seneca country. They're hoping to open up their economic interest in the West. And they arrive at a place called Tadodaho, and they invite the leadership of the Confederacy to come and talk about peace. And so they send word down to Onondaga, and the Onondagas send about 100 people north to Tadodaho, the shores of Lake Ontario. And there, the leader of the French invasion, Denonville, takes them all captive, and it's a grand deception. And he, in fact, sends all the men all the way back to France to work as galley slaves for the king on the river, where his big galley ship would go up and down on the river. And the priest, the Jesuit priest, the French Jesuit priest, who was at Onondaga during this whole incident, is then in serious jeopardy. Word gets out of what treachery occurred, and down at Onondaga, that priest, Lamberville, is in serious trouble because the community could try to exact revenge on him at any moment. But he pleads with the Onondaga leadership, and he tells them he had no idea what was going on. He didn't have prior knowledge. He didn't realize and know of the deception, and that he's innocent. And he asks for understanding and trust. And the Onondaga leadership, rather than turn him over to the warriors for certain torture and death, him and his men, his workers, the Done, they decide to believe him, and they say, we have to believe your words are true. And they actually send escorts to take him and escape from Onondaga in the middle of the night, because they said that even though we believe you, we can't control the young men, what they might do. And that is an example of what we call the good mind. Using the good mind, believing in the words of another, whether or not they're being truthful or not, they say you have to believe what they're saying. That's the good mind.
Wow, that's cool. Okay, 2 more questions. I'll ask the one I added. Somebody told me just in the last week or something, so the story of how the Tuscarora are brought up in the 1700s, I think. Somebody said there was a link to sort of a rescuing them from slavery or some sort of, I don't know, is there some angle on that or something
I haven't
you know
heard anything about
that?
slavery. But
They
the story
demons.
does talk about the Haudenosaunee ideas, concepts of the family of man, the humanity as a family. In the early 1700s, in what is now present-day North Carolina, the English colony had been growing and growing in strength, population, and power, and they were pushing the Aboriginal inhabitants further west, and the Tuscarora people, who were an Iroquoian people, had split off, anciently and moved down into the south, were experiencing war, the Tuscarora Wars, and the English were really poised to wiping them out. And so the Tuscarora needed to find a solution and a place to live. So they actually went up and asked the people in what is now Pennsylvania. They asked the Delaware people if they could live among them, and their request was rejected. And so then they had to ask people further north, who were the Haudenosaunee. And according to Haudenosaunee concepts, right, each nation within the Confederacy is like a family, all living under one roof, with the sky as the ceiling and the earth as the floor, and with the ability to extend the rafters of the house and include new family in it. That occurs at the lowest level, like of an individual as an alien citizen being accepted by the women into their community, and it scales up to nations. And so the Tuscarora petition Onondaga, and the Confederacy agrees that they can be hosted, and the Oneida Nation, who was the ones designated to be the adopters, they accept the Tuscaroras into their community and territory, give them land to live at, and they call them nephews. And over time, throughout that century at least, the American Revolution forces lots of people to have to leave their homelands, and the Tuscaroras have to move west. They make a stop at the Genesee River, and for a period of time, there's a community there in the 1780s, and then they end up having to live and receiving land within the boundaries of the Seneca communities nearest to Tonawanda, and that's where they reside even till today.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, there's some good stuff in that. Let's see. So then my last question. It's pretty broad, but I think you'll have some things to say about it. So as a Rochesterian, someone that lives in this region today, what is the thinking? Like, how do we reconcile, all the atrocities and bad things of history? I mean, it's like, here we are today, with what is, and obviously there's been a lot of unfair things and colonialism and all those negative things of history, as well as, murder and war and all these bad things. So how do we move on today? How do we reconcile these things, between the Haudenosaunee and now, Europeans and everyone?
The United States is a country made of myths. And that's how people have sort of accepted their past in this sort of mythic sense. And in some ways, that's beneficial to create unity. But in other ways, it ignores and erases great success, but also in some ways lots of negative history and people and stories. And the way, in my view, the path to reconcile these events is really twofold. And I would borrow one concept from the Haudenosaunee people to say that when you try to make a reconciliation, the very first thing you do is condole and console the other group for things that have happened in the past. And that occurs with words, with ceremony, and with the representative wampum. So that process has never taken place. The United States really has never really atoned for the events of the past and the way that this country was rolled out over the bodies of my ancestors. And secondly, through education. If we really examine the American student that comes out of public high school through the public education system, and we survey them about how they understand the events of even just their region, of Rochester, for example, Greater Rochester, Western New York, or New York State. If we examine what they're coming away with, how are they emerging from what we consider the best education on the planet, right? if we examine what they're actually coming away with, do they have a clear understanding of why their school exists on the land that wasn't always the school's land? Like, what happened there? If they don't have a sense of that, they don't come away with a real understanding of that, then we're just simply churning out ignorant Americans year after year after year after year. And so really it stems from a poor focus on history and true education of what took place. Through that, I think people then can resolve in their heads, this is the way things are, this is how it took place, and how can we make this better for everybody? How can we not make those mistakes? How can we make things better for everybody? So it's a simple matter of science. Evaluate where you're falling short and fix it. And through that, in the strength of all these minds, thinking and knowing the truth, resolutions and reconciliation will come from that. That's my concept.
Yeah, that's good. So what do you hope to see in the future?
Well, here at Ganondagan, that's our role. Museums, in a lot of ways, have to fill the gaps for public education, for education in general. And we've been trying to share these messages with all the people who come here and the literally thousands of students that we've been able to see. But we only get an hour with them, hour and a half with them. It's very difficult to change somebody's mind, through what is essentially a YouTube video. So I think it has to go deeper, but we're doing our best here.
Yeah, that's good. That's basically it.
Okay.
Is there any last thought you have that kind of?
Yeah, I just for your knowledge, my name is Michael Galban. I'm the curator of the Seneca Art and Culture Center. I'm a Washoe and Northern Paiute from the Great Basin, and happy to do this for you.